Hello and welcome to TIA Now. I'm Casey Swanson, Director of Global Policy for the Telecommunications Industry Association. And joining me today to talk about China and trade and ICT policy is Chris Millward, President and Managing Director of UCITO, the U.S. Information Technology Office, which represents the tech industry in Beijing. So Chris, earlier this week, President Xi Jinping gave a speech making a lot of promises about opening up trade in China. Do you think this is meaningful for the ICT industry? How do you view this?
Well, it could be meaningful. The speech itself was fairly general. There wasn't a lot of specifics. Mm-hmm. And if there are, following from that speech, there are specific actions to be taken that would create market opening, that would create a level playing field for companies in China, then it could be meaningful. However, much of what was offered in Xi's speech had been promised earlier, was already in process. And so there's not a lot new in his speech. And therefore it perpetuates the perception that China is not actually introducing new openings as much as retreading old statements, and those have not come to fruition. Therefore, there's a lot of, I think, skepticism amongst the industry and trading partners generally that this would actually ultimately be very meaningful. So I think it could be, and certainly we will be looking very closely at what concrete steps are taken. Right. But at the moment, there isn't anything that's been announced. There is a lot of skepticism, and it's warranted in that China has made numerous commitments over the years, many of which have not been fulfilled, and there's no reason to expect that these are different until they start actually becoming real.
Now, I wonder if you could talk a little bit. Obviously, we're paying a lot of attention here in DC to Section 301, the effects that it could have on trade and U.S. companies as well, some of which use imported components from China. How is the Section 301 investigation or the resulting tariffs at this point, how's that being viewed in China?
Well, not well. Officially, the response has been very negative and reactive. It has also been characterized by contrasting China and positioning China as a defender of the global trading system and the WTO and free trade against what is being portrayed as protectionism on the U.S. part. The official reaction was an announcement from MOFCOM, the Ministry of Foreign Commerce, that China would have tariffs on $50 billion of U.S. goods coming into China. The Chinese tariffs were very interesting when you look at them. In our industry, they don't figure in very much at all. But in terms of soybeans and beef and some key agricultural exports to China, in terms of automotive and aircraft, the tariffs that China announced seem to be very broad and targeted at products that are manufactured across the country here in the U.S. and potentially therefore causing some reaction and discomfort amongst a very broad political base here in the U.S. So I think the tariffs, China had quite a long time to consider what products to put tariffs on, because the 301 announcement or the 301 investigation was begun, I believe, in August last year. So the result of that and the $50 billion that China announced is very clear. I think from the tech industry perspective, it's also quite notable that although tech transfer was one of the key aspects that was the 301 investigation was supposed to look into, technology does not factor heavily in either the initial U.S. tariffs or the China's response. And I suspect that is more a matter of both sides looking at being very careful with the supply chains that exist in the technology industry and trying not to disrupt them and hurt their own companies, rather than not seeing technology as a product that could be targeted. So.
And I know there are some other potential remedies as well as the draft tariffs that are still in the pipeline that we haven't seen yet. But at this point, it sounds like tariffs may not necessarily be seen as likely to affect change in the kinds of technology transfer programs that China has in place. Is that fair to say?
I think it's very fair to say. The reality is that the tariffs, both in terms of the products that were announced for tariffs, as well as just the very nature of tariffs themselves, don't address the issues that were raised in the investigation.
Which are more systemic.
They're
broad,
more systemic. They're
issues.
really issues of forced technology transfers or intellectual property, and the tariffs are a way of causing economic pain on both sides, and I'm sure that will happen. And then I guess the question about the tariffs is, are they causing sufficient pain to engender a response? And I believe in China's case, perhaps not so much, in the sense that Chinese exports to the U.S. That were named in the tariff list, China's been consistently building markets in Central Asia and Europe and Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America, South America, and diversifying its global footprint and growing its global footprint. It's not that the U.S. market isn't important, but losing access to the U.S. market or having to spend more to gain access is not something that I think the Chinese are unable to stomach or to put up with. I think some of the other remedies in the 301 are more interesting to look at in this regard. So the investment restrictions actually targets an area that is more central to the issue of technology transfer, because in the past, mergers and acquisitions has been a way to acquire technologies. And so Chinese companies have, in some cases successfully, in other cases not successfully, attempted to buy technology, intellectual property from Europe, from the US, and to then bring it back to China to benefit their own companies.
Okay. And let me ask you one last question. It seems to me that if anything, China is sort of doubling down on its on imposing restrictions on technology and the internet, and we saw that I think in the recent bureaucratic upgrade of the cyberspace administration of China. Can you speak to that a little bit and what you think that signifies?
The primary objective of the Chinese government is the long-term sustainability and the long-term viability of the party. And Xi Jinping, in his first 5 years, and now after the removal of term limits for an indefinite period of the future, at the center of everything, of almost every one of his programs, there is the question, does this contribute to the party's strength, the party's long-term health? And so the issue of cybersecurity or anything that is a national security concern starts with, does this improve the party's position? So the restrictions that we've seen coming out of the Cyberspace Administration of China, which has now been upgraded, often look at commercial sectors that we would not consider national security and sort of put them into the same bucket as traditional national security interests, such as the internet or e-commerce platforms, telecom networks, and particularly the commercial side of that, not sort of the public safety systems or anything like that. And so the reason for that is that in the Chinese system, the flow of information, the potential spread of politically sensitive or socially disruptive information is considered a national security interest because it potentially threatens the viability of the party or potentially threatens the credibility of the party. And thus, it is, in the Chinese system, what we consider to be the commercial space, they consider often to be a national security concern. And so the Cyberspace Administration of China in March during the government meetings was officially tabbed to be upgraded to the cyberspace, or the Central Cyberspace Affairs Committee. What that essentially does is take CAC, or the Cyberspace Administration, which was an interagency body that had originally been more of a temporary body to help draft the cybersecurity law and put in place cybersecurity regulations, and they've now been upgraded to a party committee that reports directly into the senior government, senior leadership, and the committee now has enforcement authority, including management of the Great Firewall, a very famous part of China's cyberspace or cybersecurity management program, and the C-inserts. And so they now have much more resources and much more enforcement authority to actually go out and enforce cybersecurity law in China. And so we're expecting to see a continued rafts of tranches of legislation of measures to continue to circumscribe the internet and commercial networks to ensure that they fit within the constraints that that Cyberspace Administration, or now the Cybersecurity Committee, considers important. So.
Right. Well, we'll continue to keep tabs on growing restrictions that affect ICT companies in China, certainly. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Sure. My pleasure.